If you have your Bibles, open to Genesis 49. We've been studying Genesis 49 for a few weeks now, and we've been seeing in the life of Joseph that one of the major themes throughout the narrative about his life is the faithfulness of God, how God fulfills his word, his promises. And in chapters 48 and 49, we see God giving new promises in the final words of Jacob to his sons. In chapter 48 was a special time where Jacob was blessing Joseph above the others by adopting Joseph's two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, and giving them a full portion, and they becoming half-tribes. And thus, Joseph has a double portion, a double blessing. And then in chapter 49, we move to a more general scene where Jacob is now blessing and communicating his final words to the 12 sons. And in doing that, the way it's worded in chapter 49, it's clear that these words that he's sharing are both prophetic and applicational. They are prophecy that God has revealed to him about the future of the descendants of these sons who will become tribes, and also these are words that they can apply, that they should listen and obey. So we want to, as we go forward, continue to look at these words in those two aspects. What is it saying about the future? And what is it saying about how God's people can apply these words? And so the words become general proverbs of life in this world as God's people. And thus far, we've covered Jacob's 10 sons, words to his 10 sons. The first three were Reuben, or first four, rather. Reuben, he lost his preeminent position of authority and power in the family because of his indiscretion. And it shows us that we need to be responsible with the privileged positions of authority that we have, that we're given. Simeon and Levi, they were cursed for their uncontrollable violence and their negative influence upon one another. And their curse was that they would be scattered throughout Israel. They wouldn't have necessarily land. And it exhorts us to encourage one another towards godliness, towards holiness and wisdom, and not revenge, not wickedness, not sin. To Judah was praised, and it was prophesied that a king would come from Judah who would be victorious over Israel's enemies. He would unite the tribes and usher in a time of abundance and of blessing. And in the short term, it referred to David, but in the ultimate term, it refers to Christ, the ultimate king. But it teaches us that godly rule brings about safety, it brings about security, it brings about blessing. The next three sons were Zebulun, who Jacob said that he would dwell towards the sea, and he would benefit from the traders that would come in from the sea, from the other nations. And it just reminds Israel that they are not to be isolationists, but those who are dealing and interacting with the world around them, specifically through business dealings and being a witness to them. Issachar was pictured as that donkey who was strong, was ready for work, had the two bags on him, but he was lying down, was sitting, was resting. And it was prophesied that whole tribe would become slaves. And it encouraged the people that they needed to finish the task that God has laid before them, before they rest, before they were able to find rest. Dan, which his name means judgment or vindication, it's prophesied that he will rule over his people, over the people, and will be God's servant to deliver the tribes from their enemies. And he will act like a snake, who is small but will strike at a defense at an incoming horse, and the horseman will fall. And it shows that even a small tribe can be delivered. It can deliver a nation, a great people, with God, with God's help and with his wisdom. Gad, whose name means good fortune, will face continual raiding from the enemies that are all around him. But God has also promised that he will be victorious in defending itself. Which reminds them and reminds us to be on guard, to be ready to defend against those who seek us harm, seeking justice through the means by which God has provided for us. Asher, which means happiness, he's only given blessing, saying that he will have an abundant crops, and the fruits from his lands will be good enough for kings. And that, the goodness of God's land, the fruits of God's lands, are to bring him happiness and joy. And they should bring us happiness and joy as well. Naphtali is viewed as a young doe that's unleashed, and it reminds us that he will give a report throughout the land as a messenger of good things. And it reminds us to share the good things that God is doing in our lives and has done as a testimony and encouragement to others. Now this leads us to the life of Joseph, the parting words of Jacob, part 3, where we'll finish the chapter today. In Genesis 49, verses 22 through 33, we're going to consider Jacob's final words to his 2 other sons, and then the conclusion of his parting words. So we have 3 sections yet to cover today. So the next son that Jacob talks to and addresses is Joseph. Now, Joseph is Jacob's 11th son, but it's the first son from Rachel. And now these words that he speaks to Joseph applies to his 2 sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. And this message to Joseph is the largest message, is the biggest message. And we can understand why. And the message breaks down into 3 sections, 3 parts. In the first part, it speaks of Joseph's prosperity. Verse 22, it says, Joseph is a fruitful bough by a spring. Its branches run over a wall. Now, literally, when it says fruitful bough, it actually says son of fruitfulness. But because there's a plant metaphor, instead of son, they've translated it bough, which is just giving more of the metaphorical image. And this could be a branch from a tree or a branch from a vine, like a grapevine. Either way. That's why I have a picture of a mosaic that actually has a tree and a grapevine. So I covered all the bases. But what this is characteristic of, if you are a son of something, it means you are being described this way. So it's this metaphorical picture is saying that Joseph and his descendants are going to be characterized by being productive. They are going to be bringing about good things. They're going to be fruitful. And that's the first line. The second line repeats it, but it also says that there will be a fruitful bough by a spring. Now, every plant needs water. So if they're by a spring, there's a continual source that will allow them to continually be productive. So this is not going to be a one-time deal. This is going to be a continual characteristic of their life because they're well provided for. Now, there are many examples of people who are likened to fruitful plants by water. And Ezekiel 19:10, it says, your mother was like a vine in your vineyard, planted by the waters. It was fruitful and full of branches because of the abundant waters. So there's a clear connection between waters and just the growth and the fruit. And I listed a few other verses that talk about plants or trees being by waters and becoming fruitful because of it, never losing their leaves and being glorious. In the third line, it says, its branches run over a wall. Now, the word for branches there is literally daughters. And the word for run can also mean march over the wall. And what the idea is here is that it will continually grow. Its descendants will grow, and its heights will go over a wall. And thus, it will be successful. It will be glorious. It will be successful and productive beyond its borders or beyond its expectations. And now this idea of going over a wall, it could simply mean that where the wall is of, let's say, the garden or a home, it's going up and over and beyond expectations, or its blessings will flow beyond its borders. Or it can be a military term, specifically because that word for run can mean march, meaning it will go over the walls of its enemies. So it could be either way, but the general idea is still the same. It's going to be productive. It's going to be abundant. It's going to have great success in what they do. It's referring to Joseph's descendants of Ephraim and Manasseh. And that's the first part, their prosperity. Second part speaks of Joseph's protection. Verse 23 and 24 say, the archers bitterly attack him and shot at him and harassed him. And his bow remained firm, and his arms were agile. Now, in ancient scripture, in the Old Testament, when it talks about a bow, it's talking about military strength. So here, he is being attacked by other military forces. But, although he's being attacked, he remains firm. He dwells continually. And his arm remains agile, meaning it's moving quickly. And the idea there is moving quickly as in he's firing back. His arm is just continually going and warding off and fighting against the attackers. And it's interesting because that phrase, his arms were agile, when it says his arms, it's actually, it literally says the arms of his hands. And it's an interesting phrase which doesn't really make much sense in English, but in Hebrew the idea is there is when someone's hand, the hand of God, or by Joseph's hand, it shows that your active part and strength in the matter. So the descendants of Joseph, the arms, which are his strength, the means of his strength, which is his hands. Does that make sense? So the text is saying that his strength, his actions will be quick and will ward off his enemies. And then the text is clear concerning the source. This is not coming from Joseph's strength or his will or the skill of the people. The strength and the success of Joseph's descendants, it comes from God. And Jacob uses three beautiful pictures of God. It says it's from the hands of the mighty one of Jacob. From there is the shepherd, the stone of Israel. Now remember, the word here, the phrase his arms, is literally from the arms of his hands. So all of a sudden it's his hands are active, but it's from the hands of the mighty one. So there's a play and a jump, a connection between the hands of Joseph. Their strength, their ability is coming from the hands of God. And here the mighty one, the word for mighty, it connotes power and strength to deliver or to save. Save from one's enemies. So here it is the mighty one of Jacob, communicating that this is the God who has acted powerfully for Jacob, and he will also act powerfully for Joseph. And then it says from there, from his hands, from his activity, his action in the world, he is the one that is a shepherd. The word for shepherd there is a participle. It probably means the one who is shepherding. It focuses more on his activity. So as a shepherd, God leads, he protects, he provides. And it's interesting, in Genesis 48:15, Jacob is already called God as shepherd, one who has protected him and led him throughout his life. So here again, at the end of his life, it's saying it's God's actions, his involvement in the world, that shepherds his people. And then finally, the third picture is that he's a stone of Israel. Now, we're used to the rock of Israel, referring to a mountain or boulder, something that's unmoved. The word rock can mean that as stone, can mean that as well. So that's what it probably means here. It's focusing on the large, immovable, secure faithfulness of God, of divine support, like a foundation. He is a stone of Israel, something that's immovable as a mountain. And specifically the stone of Israel, that phrase is only used here in the whole Bible. And it could also be connected with and reflect Jacob's commemoration of Yahweh's promises in Bethel. In Bethel, when God gave him a vision, both first of the ladder, but also coming back, and also before he came to Egypt, God reiterated his promises, and it says that Jacob stood up a stone there as a memory and called it Bethel. So it can refer to the stone of Israel, meaning the one who's made promises and a covenant faithfulness. And once again, referring to the divine faithfulness and support. So notice that these three descriptions of Yahweh, they emphasize his relationship to man. And how does he relate to man? He's the mighty one to save. He's the shepherd that leads, guides, protects. And he's a stone that's faithful and a support. It's everything that we need. He's a God that fulfills our needs. That is the second section. The third section speaks of Joseph's blessings. Continuing on verse 25, it says, "From the God of your father who helps you, and by the Almighty who blesses you, with blessings of heaven above, blessings from the deep that lies beneath, blessings of the breast and of the womb, the blessing of your father, having surpassed the blessings of your ancestors, up to the utmost bound of the eternal hills." So going back to 25, it says, "From the God of your father who helps you." Notice it is not your fathers, plural, but it's your father, singular, referring to himself. It's singular, it refers to Jacob, and Yahweh has been Jacob's God, and he has lived with Jacob. He has been helped by Yahweh, and Jacob has spoken about Yahweh, and he's passed down that worship and the relationship with Yahweh to his son Joseph. And here it says, this blessing is going to come from the God that I serve, that who's helped me. He's going to help you. And by the Almighty who blesses you. The Almighty there is the word Shaddai. It is focused on God's sovereign rule and authority over creation to bring about judgment, either blessing and life or judgment and death. And here, obviously in the context, it's blessing and life. And that's emphasized with the repetition of the word blessing throughout, 6 times here. Now when we speak about a blessing, generally speaking, we're speaking about the removal of sin and its effects. So thus the word conveys good things. In the New Testament, the Greek word for blessing is words that speak good things. Eulogeo, you meaning good, and good logos is good words or thoughts or ideas. And here, it's specifically described in a few ways. And it's a common Old Testament ancient blessing. The first one is with blessings from the heaven above and blessings from the deep that lies underneath. So from above, blessings from above, that refers to rain. You've heard in the Old Testament especially, pray for rain. And may the rain come, because the rain brings life. It brings crops, which people need in order to live. And then the blessings of the deep from beneath, that's referring to springs of water and wells, where people, again, get water for themselves to live and for animals. And so water is needed for life, and that comes from God. And so here, Jacob is blessing Joseph and his descendants with the blessings of water from above and from below. And in the scriptures, when it gives both extremes, it usually refers to everything else that's in between. So the blessings of water from heaven, the blessings of water from underneath to give life, and that which produces life and abundance in the earth, and thus all the other blessings that come in between. And when we refer to the water from the heavens agriculturally, and then waters from wells to give drinks to animals and for people, those are more designed towards male interests, things that the men of that time were focused on. And then he switches over and speaks about something that's more interest to women, which is the rearing of children. Not to say that men and women are not interested in any of the other things, but there were priorities in the ancient world. So here he's giving a blessing of the breast and of the womb. The womb is a blessing of fertility, that they can bear children. And breast, so they can nurse infants, and they can grow. And because it gives kind of a split between male interest and female interest, it's showing that Jacob's giving a blessing not just to men, but to women as well. It's a combined whole blessing to all the people, to all the descendants. And in verse 26, it says that the blessing of your father, which is singular again, which refers to Jacob. And then the next line, there's a little bit of debate there. It says, have surpassed the blessings of my ancestors. The phrase my ancestors has been debated. And The reason why it's debated is a couple of reasons, but in Hebrew, as you can see, there's only one letter difference between my ancestors and the eternal mountains. It's just this second letter if it has a longer top. And that's a vav or a resh. And if the first word is correct, which is found in the Hebrew text that exist today, it refers to my ancestors, which would be Abraham and Isaac. And it would thus be saying the blessings of me, of Jacob, may they come to you and have that which has surpassed the blessings of my fathers. And if that's what the text is saying, it's referring to the blessings that he has in mind is of his wives, his numerous possessions that were much greater than either Abraham or Isaac, and the blessings of all the sons. And all that blessing and goodness and graces of God is passed down to Joseph. Or if it's referring to the eternal mountains, then it's referring to the blessing of Jacob, having surpassed the blessings of what is produced on the eternal mountains. So once again, it's looking at agriculture and everything that comes from it. And that's speaking a lot, because remember, the land of Israel is the land of milk and honey. Milk coming from cows because they graze in the luscious area, and honey coming from natural bees because there's lots of flowers, because the land is productive. So that in the ancient world, that's a great blessing as well. And a lot of commentators believe that it should be eternal mountains there, because it goes parallel very nicely with the next line, up to the utmost bounds of the everlasting hills, referring to the same kind of concept. And there's a parallel passage that Moses gives in Deuteronomy when he blesses the sons of Joseph and says, with the best things of the ancient mountains and with the choice things of the eternal hills. So that parallel is there again in Deuteronomy. So it probably refers to the eternal mountains, the blessing of creation of the land. Moving on to the very end of verse 26, it says, and may they, all these blessings, be on the head of Joseph, on the crown of his head, of the one distinguished among his brothers. Now they referring to the blessings of God granted to Jacob. So all these things, they're being passed down from Jacob to Joseph and his descendants. And Joseph is given special honor above his brothers. Now when it refers to the crown of his head, it's not referring to a crown of a rulership or a golden circular object, but it's the crown literally of his skull. It's the place of blessing on his head. So in this whole passage about Joseph, what is being prophesied is, number one, that Joseph's descendants of Ephraim and Manasseh, they're going to be great in number. The descendants are going to be huge, which we've already seen in the prophecy in chapter 48 to the sons specifically. They're also going to be victorious in battle. And then also they're going to be prosperous from all the earth's provisions. And this goes very nicely with Joseph's name, which means added, to be added. So these blessings are added to Joseph. And what do we take from this? What do we hear and listen? What do we need to obey? Well, these blessings, the provision, the protection, the good things from life, they come from God alone. These are blessings from God. And we need to seek Him for those blessings and thank Him for those blessings, enjoy them when they come from His hand. Now, the final son that Jacob speaks of is Benjamin. Benjamin is the 12th son of Jacob, and he's the second son from Rachel. And to Benjamin, he only speaks one verse, verse 27, which says, Benjamin is a ravenous wolf. In the morning he devours the prey, and in the evening he divides the spoil. Now the general idea here is one of military victory over his enemy. When it says that he's a ravenous wolf, it literally means he's a wolf that tears things to pieces. And then he goes on to describe that by saying, in the morning he devours his prey, and then in the evening he divides the spoil. So you can see a contrast between morning and evening. And that's a very short amount of time. And it shows the speed at which he defeats his enemies. he goes to battle in the morning, but by evening he's already enjoying and sharing the rewards as a people from the victory. That's when you're dividing up the spoils of war, the things that you've taken over. And we know from various texts in the Old Testament, in Judges and in Chronicles, that Benjamin, the men of Benjamin, are known for having great skill and being brave warriors. And that as well goes right along with his name, which is son of the right hand, or the place of honor or fortune. Benjamin will be honored as a warrior and will find fortune through that. So the prophecy is quite simple. It's that his tribe, the tribe of Benjamin, the descendants of Benjamin, will be great warriors and they'll be victorious in battle. And what we can gain from this is that God's people, they're united. They need to be united in facing enemies and be a force, a united force against enemies. Benjamin, as a tribe, as a people, devour the prey. And as a people, they divide the spoils. So as a united group, God's people also need to enjoy the rewards of victory as a people. I think of the New Testament where it says we bear one another's burdens, or we weep with those who weep, and we rejoice with those who rejoice. That's why we share good things so that we can enjoy. I think about as well when Paul commissioned all the churches to support the starving believers who were in Jerusalem, the Jerusalem famine. They were giving out of their abundance to help the other believers who had without. As God's people, we face enemies together and we enjoy the victories together. So with these words, we now come to the conclusion of Jacob's life, which is verses 28 through 33. And this as well has three parts. And the first part is the author's conclusion of Jacob's words. And the author here is Moses. And Moses says in verse 28, all these are the 12 tribes of Israel. And this is what their father said to them when he blessed them. He blessed them, everyone with a blessing appropriate to him. Now, it's interesting here that the words that Jacob are given, Moses is translating them as words given to whom? 12 tribes. But he's actually speaking to 12 sons. So in a real way, the descendants are viewed as being in these men, these 12 men. And this is the first place in the Bible where 12 tribes are used. The phrase 12 tribes are used. And again, Jacob's word here is put specifically in the context of blessing, with this repetition of 3 times in one verse. Now how? How can this be a blessing when some of these were obviously a curse, where a curse was involved? Well, it's a blessing because the divine words are given concerning life, concerning wisdom. It's given to a people who had no written, objective word of God. So here they were given revelation, the revelation of God, as a way of life, a way to live, a way to move forward, a light to their path. That was a blessing. Remember, this is over 400 years before the law is written, before Moses. So here, these words were passed down. And maybe they were written at this time, but we don't have any written record of that other than what Moses wrote. So after reiterating the tone of these final words, the author returns to record Jacob's final request to be buried in the family tomb. Verse 29 through 32 says, Then he charged them, all the sons, and said to them, I am about to be gathered to my people. Bury me with my fathers in the cave that is in the field of Ephron, the Hittite, in the cave that is in the field of Machpelah, which is before Mamre, in the land of Canaan, which Abraham bought along with the field from Ephron the Hittite for a burial site. There they buried Abraham and his wife Sarah. There they buried Isaac and his wife Rebekah. And there I buried Leah. The field of the cave that is in it, purchased from the sons of Heth. You can see in the map, this is just right outside of Hebron, somewhere in this area. And that whole story is recorded for us in Genesis 23, where Abraham bought this field, purchased this land. In this text is the first time that we learn that, or hear anything about Rebekah's death and burial, or Leah's death and burial. So obviously they are buried there as well. And for Jacob to bury Leah there, in that family tomb, and to want to be united with her in that burial, it really gives a place of honor for Leah. Rachel is buried elsewhere, towards the north, in Ramah, above Bethlehem, when they were on the way to Bethlehem. She wasn't buried in this. So here, Leah is given a great place of honor, because we see Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, now Jacob and Leah will be buried together and united. And if you notice, there's a lot of verses about a lot of detail about this field, where it comes from and where it was bought from and where it is. And this emphasis, it shows Israel's legitimate legal title to that burial ground. So this is an official claim and record of where it is in the transaction of what happened. And this request, this is the third time that Jacob made this request. In Genesis 48 and 47, he also asked Joseph twice, and he actually begged him to bury him there. Now why? Why is there such an emphasis? It refocuses Israel, specifically the descendants, the original reader, which is the people that Moses is leading out. It reorients them to the promise of Yahweh to give them that land. Remember, they've been living in Egypt for 400 years. Here in this country, we've been living here for a little bit over 250. Imagine if 150 years in the future, we say, oh, this is not our land. We need to go somewhere else. We're comfortable here. This is where you've always known. So these promises, this request, it shows Jacob's faith in God's words. That's where he should be buried, because that is his land. You are buried in the land of your ancestors, in the land that you belong. So he wants to be buried there, showing a great faith, not in the land of Egypt, but in the land, in the future of their people. And this is what God had promised already in Genesis 46, before Jacob came down to Egypt. Remember, he stopped at Bethel, had a sacrifice, and asked God for direction. Is this really where I'm supposed to be going? And God reiterated to him that I will go down with you to Egypt, and I will also surely bring you up again. So here it's going to be literal of himself being buried there, but also he will bring up his descendants up. So after this final request, we read in the final verse of the death of Jacob. It says, when Jacob finished charging his sons, he drew his feet into the bed and breathed his last, and was gathered to his people. So when Jacob finished charging his son, literally it says the word for charging is the giving instructions or commandments. So after he instructed and commanded his sons to bury him there, he drew his feet up. Literally, he gathered his feet up. It's metaphorically showing that he will no longer walk on the same ground as his sons, but he's now going up into his place of rest, into his bed. And the text says he breathed his last. Now, literally in Hebrew, it just says he died. He gathered his feet into his bed and died, and was gathered to his people. Now, when it says he was gathered to his people, the idea of being gathered, it connects this verse with Jacob's last words in verse 29, where he started this, where he says, then he charged them and said to him, I'm about to be gathered to his people. Bury me there, and I'm here. That came to pass. It's a closing of his last words. And that phrase, he was gathered to his people, it communicates a few important things about death. Number one, he had died, and then he was gathered to his people. It shows that he lived on, that death was not the end. That Jacob was in fact gathered and was assembled with his people, his ancestors who worshiped Yahweh. So thus life continues in a spirit, in a spiritual realm, while his body had died and would be buried in a tomb. And that life that continues in the spiritual realm, because it's gathered or assembled with his people, it's one of community. It's one of relationships. And it's one of rest. And then notice that that word for gathered is passive. Meaning it's an action that's done to him. So who is the one that's gathering? Who is assembling him, reuniting him with his ancestors? Now, this probably speaks of the ancient thought that's found in scriptures about angels that escort the departed souls to the proper place of rest. And finally, this scene of Jacob dying here with his sons, it fulfills a promise that God gave him 17 years earlier. Going back to Genesis 46, where it says, I will go down to Egypt with you, and I will also surely bring you back up, and Joseph will close your eyes. God had promised him that he would spend those last 17 years with Joseph, and that Joseph would be there at his deathbed. So once again, at the end of Jacob's life, it shows that God is faithful to his promises and worthy to be trusted. And that concludes chapter 49. So now let's turn to applications. Number one, in Jacob's words, the activity of God in the world, referring to his hands, are described in three ways. Number one, God acts in a mighty way to deliver his people, showing his strength and power. God acts as a shepherd to his people, showing his protection, that he leads people and provides for them. And then God acts as a solid stone, showing his unchanging support and faithfulness to his people. So when we come to God, we come to him as, at the very minimum, these three things. But we need to have these concepts and thoughts in our minds, in our thinkings about this is the God that we serve. One that is mighty to save and deliver. One who shepherds us. And one who is our solid foundation. And number two, in the words to Joseph, we are taught that the blessings and prosperity, protection, and good things of life, they come from God alone. So seek to please him, to rejoice in his blessings, and to thank him for his goodness. Anything that you experience that is good, it's coming from God. Number three, in the words to Benjamin, we are taught that God's people are united in fighting against the enemy and united in the joys of victory. So carry one another's burdens. Weep with those who weep and rejoice with those who rejoice. Number four, in the Bible we are given an incredible blessing of God's written truth. Given words of life and of wisdom. We must treasure it, spend time in it, and renew our minds in it. They had words passed down to them orally. We have words, revelation, that are written. We can continually go back to. And in our time, in our age, each one of us has our own copy. Each one of us has multiple copies. It is an incredible blessing of wealth. And we need to view it and act accordingly, and take advantage of that. And that is part of God's blessing to us. Number five, in the testimony that Jacob has gathered to his people, we learn that life continues in spirit after one's physical death. And that life is one of community, of relationships, and of rest. And then number six, as Jacob died in the presence of Joseph, we are again shown the faithfulness of God as a 17-year-old promise is fulfilled. Our God is worthy of our faith and of our trust. Okay? Is there anything you want to add? Or anything you want to say, or question, or ask a question about?